Wednesday morning and voted on if the government opposes it on Wednesday evening. It's a very simple bill. It's a bill called the National Minimum Wage Equal Pay for Young Workers Bill, and it's a bill to end the perverse, discriminatory and exploitative situation whereby those under the age of 20 are legally allowed to be discriminated against on the basis of their age and are legally allowed to be paid even less than the minimum wage. So we know that the minimum wage is completely inadequate for people to survive on, given the cost of living crisis. But we have a situation where many people, about 15,000 workers, are paid legally even less than the minimum wage purely on the basis that they're less than 20. So if you're 19, you can be paid 90% of the minimum wage, 18, 80%, 17 or under, 70% of the minimum wage. So you have people working for less than €8 an hour. We think this is an absolute scandal. It goes against the basic principle of equal pay for equal work. These people are not being paid less because they're on some sort of trainee rate, because if their equivalent comes in age 20 or 25 or 30 or whatever, they are legally entitled to the minimum wage. They're purely being paid less on the basis of their age, which we think is scandalous. That's why the bill has very broad support across the entire trade union movement, from the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. Mandate Unite has the support of the entire students' union movement. USI, UCD Students' Union has the support of the secondary school students' union. Situation which will be particularly acute at summertime, when obviously there's more young people working extra hours, and it has an effect throughout the year, but in particular in the summertime, on all workers. So this isn't just an issue for those who are 17, 18 or 19 and are struggling to make ends meet. It's also an issue for older workers, because you'll have some cases whereby employers in retail or in the pub trade will prefer to take on young people on less than the minimum wage, as opposed to giving extra hours at minimum wage or above to slightly older workers. So very simple bill. We think it is, completely unjustifiable situation to have workers be paid even less than the minimum wage. Obviously, if you're 18, 19 or 20, or 17, 18 or 19, you can't go to your landlord and say, here's 90% of the rent. You can't go to a supermarket and say, here's 80% of the price of my goods. They have to buy goods and services at the same price as the rest of us, and should be entitled at the very least to the minimum wage. Obviously, we're in favour of increasing the minimum wage to an actual living wage. So we're building a campaign of pressure. There's a rally outside the Dáil tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. involving some of the trade unions and the students' unions to try and say to the government not to block this bill, to allow the bill to go through and to get rid of this wage discrimination.
Just say a few words on the issue of the universal social charge and on the issue of the retained firefighters dispute. So first of all, on the universal social charge, it would seem as though the budget debate is starting a little bit early this year. We'll have a lot to say on that, but just on one aspect, we feel very strongly that the universal social charge should be abolished. It was brought in as a temporary measure during the austerity crisis. Fine Gael pledged in the general election of 2016 that if they were in the next government, that the universal social charge would go. It didn't. It is a real burden on the backs of working people in a cost of living crisis. It is extraordinarily unpopular. I saw one journalist said it should be shortened to the HUSC, the hated universal social charge. We're not in favour of abolishing the universal social charge and leaving the state with a lower tax take or a narrower tax base, because we're in favour of compensating for its abolition by bringing in a higher income social charge at a rate of 10% for people with incomes of €100,000 or more. And we're also in favour of the introduction of a millionaire's tax, even if that were to be introduced at a modest 2% rate on wealth of $1 million or more, excluding say a principal primary residence worth $1 million or less. If you brought it in on wealth over and above that at a rate of 2%, that wouldn't just compensate for the loss in taxation as a result of the abolition of the universal social charge for everybody else. It would leave the state with a higher tax take. You would not just balance, but you would overbalance in that sense. On the issue of the retained firefighters dispute, there are 3,000 firefighters in the state. 2,000 of them are part-time retained firefighters. They've been involved in an industrial dispute with the government now for a week. The government has not heeded the issues and points that they've raised. I mean, they're on a retainer of €8,500 a year, which is topped up then on the basis of the number of call-outs that they get. No wonder there is a huge recruitment and retainment crisis within the fire service. Those pay structures haven't been seriously changed in the last 20 years. And because the government have refused to engage in a serious way in the last week, the dispute has been escalated today. 50% of all fire stations in the state are closed today because of this dispute, and it will be escalated again if the government don't seriously address the issues within the next week. We are 100% behind the retained firefighters, and we think the general public, from the feedback we have, are strongly behind the retained firefighters as well. So we'll be raising this issue in the Dáil this week. There's a debate tonight. I'll be raising it with the Taoiseach in promised legislation slot today, and I'm sure the firefighters will increase the pressure on the government across the country. We intend to raise the pressure on them here in the Dáil as well. Okay.
Yeah, just a brief follow-on on the USC. I just think it should be noted that People Before Profit Solidarity are now the only party that are according with what is the overwhelming majority of people in this country in wanting to get rid of the universal social charge. Both government and opposition parties who previously expressed opposition to this austerity tax have now all abandoned their opposition to it. So in arguing for the abolition of the universal social charge, People Before Profit are the only people who are giving expression to the views of the majority of working people in this country that it is an unjust, unfair austerity tax that the public have been betrayed on, in that the government have refused to honour their commitment to get rid of that charge. The other point I just want to make is that we have championed the idea that you can pay for the universal social charge by having higher taxes on wealth and the very wealthy, but we haven't just said it, we've campaigned for it. So tomorrow in the Budget Scrutiny Committee, Oxfam will give a presentation on their proposal for a wealth tax, which we requested the Budget Scrutiny Committee would examine. Because we have to start taking seriously the issue of the enormous concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands that we have seen, that gap between the very, very rich and ordinary workers grow and grow exponentially, and it needs to be addressed. It's never seriously debated, and I'm very glad that the Budget Scrutiny Committee finally is going to look at that tomorrow, and I would urge journalists and the media to pay attention to the debate in the Budget Scrutiny Committee, where Oxfam will present the case for a wealth tax, which could yield billions in additional euro and pay for some alleviation on the crushing impact of the USC on working people. I just also want to mention that we will be highlighting strongly this week the Ireland for All demonstration that will take place this day week, assembling at 5:30 at the Garden of Remembrance, marching through the city centre. The Ireland for All is a very broad coalition of student unions, trade unions, NGOs, housing groups, anti-poverty groups and anti-racist groups. And the point of the demonstration is to coincide with World Refugee Day and to particularly highlight how the government's failure to address the accommodation and housing crisis has fuelled the agenda of hate and racism being pursued by the far right in this country against refugees and migrants. The fact that they have left hundreds of asylum seekers out on the streets in tents, and the fact that they have allowed record numbers of people to go homeless into emergency accommodation is fueling the vicious racist agenda of the far right, and the government need to be held to account for that. And we also want to highlight the fact that when we are looking at labour shortages in construction to build the houses we need, in the health system where we desperately need people, it makes no sense not to actually assist migrants coming into this country to be trained and employed to work to help build the houses we need, and to work in the health service, which is massively understaffed. So we will be highlighting that demonstration and its importance in advance of the protest next Tuesday.
I want to, as climate spokesperson for People Before Profit, talk about the latest figures on the consumption of electricity by data centres. They're quite shocking. 18% now of the state's electricity is being consumed by data centres alone, and the CSO figures show that that's equivalent to all urban household usage. And we had predicted this, we had argued for it. We put a bill before the Dáil last year to ban the proliferation of data centres. Instead, Crew at the end of 2021 gave us a moratorium with some restrictions on planning applications, but that has clearly failed. And for Simon Coveney and Eamon Ryan to say that this is an important industry, it'll work well, it'll work out that it'll be more efficient and help us reach our targets, is actually just spin for the industry. That's all they're doing, and they're really risking a huge amount for this state. We've had an Amber Alert, we will have more, and the only thing that can stop this and curtail it is a proper, real discussion about what use are data centres. They don't employ that many people. Obviously we need them for what we're doing here, for social media, etc., but the proliferation of them in this state is obscene, and it amounts to, at the moment, 18% of our electricity usage. It will be 30% by 2030. There are 16 more data centres have permission to connect to the national electricity grid, and 11 to the gas grid. So we can't sustain this, and unless we do something about it and call out the government for being a spin doctors for the industry rather than thinking in a sensible way about the needs of this state, then we are going for real, obviously we're not going to reach our targets. We know that from the EPA figures already, but this is about what sort of country we want to run and who consumes our electricity and why. The average of usage of data centres across the globe is 3 to 4%, 18% of the electricity grid in this country and rising. So that is why we're going to reintroduce that bill that we put before the Houses last year to ban any more planning applications from the planning system for data centres in the future. And we'll be doing that either this week or next week, reintroducing it into the Dáil.
Just on that topic, Brie, the Taoiseach was asked about this on the way to Cabinet this morning, and he said that although data centres themselves aren't a huge employer, that the tech sector is responsible for tens of billions of corporate tax, employs 100,000 people, and that this is kind of a necessary infrastructure for them, and that he believes that with the amount of renewable power that Ireland intends to create, wind, offshore and the likes in the coming years, that it's going to be possible for Ireland to sustain that level of data.
Well, I think he's fooling himself and he's fooling the people as well, because whatever renewable energy we get, we are going to need for, for homes, for industry, for everything else that has to happen, for hospitals, for schools. Instead of that, most of it will be guzzled by these data centres. The proliferation, there's no rhyme or reason to it other than to facilitate the industry itself. No other country is doing this. Ireland is a complete outlier, and we're going to suffer concrete results of that in the near future. We're going to suffer that anyway, but it has to stop, and the point of this bill would be to put a complete ban on any more, because the moratorium that they boasted about and said would help has not helped at all, and it's quite shocking to see the amount of hyper data centres that are also coming on stream and will be connected to the grid in the near future. And remember as well that they don't just guzzle electricity, they also guzzle huge amounts of water, and if we're heading for the hottest summer ever, we're going to have water shortages, but this industry will be facilitated for that reason, and it just doesn't make sense. And yes, we know we need data, we know we need what we're all doing here, what we do on our phones, but we haven't had a real conversation about why we need so much, so many, and increasingly much more. And I think that conversation has to look at what do data centres actually do. And nobody ever wants to talk about that. They just say, well, you've just put that on Twitter, so you're using them. That's true, but what do they actually do? Why do we need to risk 30% of national electricity output from this small state for this industry? What are they actually doing? Most of it is probably, if we drill down into it, is probably to help them to advertise, to find out what our behaviour is like, to mine our information and to use that to sell more stuff. And that is not a useful way of running an economy or indeed running our electricity system, and it does risk the emissions going through the roof.